And thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz, Monday through Friday, usually 12 noon, sometimes 1 o'clock, live on YouTube and on all of my subscribing platforms. Dooovid is back, and my guest, Dooovid, is a traditional Jew. He's an expert on Jewish issues, and particularly with a Chabad orientation. Dooovid, would you say?
Well, I'm not officially Chabad. Because Chabad is the biggest Hasidic group in Detroit, I work closely with Chabad, but actually I
Mhm.
studied under different Hasidic groups that most people never heard of. So Chabad is everywhere. And, like Bubov, I was in Bubov Yeshiva, and there's a few people from like Bubov background, but there's no Bubov in Detroit. And, Tol Sabram Yitzchak, and a lot of learned scholars have heard of the Rebbes I've studied under, the Sklener Rebbe. But they don't have yeshivas and shuls in major urban centers all over the world like Chabad. So I work with Chabad, but technically I'm not a Chabadster.
Oh, okay. And before we get started, I hope you don't mind, but I might as well. It's my show. What the heck? I need to take a very brief and shameless plug for my new book, which is now available. Let me see if I can get it there. Um, I'm having it reformatted. It's a little big, but it's available on Amazon and at all major bookstores. It's coming in as actually of this week. So I'm pleased over that. And I'm doing some interviews on it. I've got Alex Newman from the New American Magazine is having me on next week and some other people as well. And I'm just looking forward to getting into a discussion on a topic that normally I don't talk about, which is God and faith. Usually I get into the political issues. I'm not, I would say, David, that I am pashat when it comes to Torah and Talmud. Very surface knowledge. I don't claim to be a scholar. I'm not a theologian. I don't have a degree in Jewish studies or, I'm not, I would not even describe myself in the strict sense as Orthodox, although I'm very traditional and have become more so. Really, starting with my marriage, I became more religious. But wait a minute, let me just put this off here. The we were talking earlier about the phenomena of trying to talk with Jewish leaders, Jewish thinkers, Jewish theologians about questions of Talmud and of Jewish history, not necessarily from the standpoint of going over particular tractates and discussing the debates between rabbis on various issues and how they apply to Jewish life, but a general discussion of the philosophy of the Talmud and where the Talmud falls in Jewish life and in the world and what the Talmud is. So I guess my question to you, David, is why is there such reticence on the part of Jewish thinkers and Jewish rabbis to have this discussion?
Um, well, there's multiple reasons. I mean, one is the tradition itself is very hesitant to give the information to, so to say, outsiders. And that doesn't just necessarily mean, non-Jews and anti-Semites. It could even mean, secular Jews. Yeah, like the Torah itself, the Talmud. I mean, all the crazy things in the Talmud. The Talmud says itself multiple times. God forbid, I don't think it ever happened, but the punishment for a non-Jew learning Torah is death. And even secular Jews, like in Israel, if like if you're not considered Sabbath observant, some people would hold like it's forbidden to teach this person Torah. So that could
Mm.
go back. We could discuss the historical reasons why that might be, but certainly within Judaism, there's a sense that like tell them something inaccurate. Don't tell them the real truth. You could only tell the real truth to people in the know. And then there's also the people who actually read our books and our texts. Judaism proposes some pretty astonishing things that your average person, including the majority of Jews, would, God forbid, be like, that's ridiculous. No
Mm.
one could believe it. So, in terms of what does it mean to be a Jew, what does it mean to believe that the creator of the whole world has some sort of special relationship with this tribe, the Jewish people, um, and to how the sages who are proposing this belief system is much different than what your common Jew would say. Like, if you're talking me and you are mostly popular for arguing with counter Semites. Like page one of Chabad, the Tanya. Do we have a different soul or not? Saying I believe in Chabad. I believe in the sages. So just straight up, you know, do I have a different soul or not? And so if you ask your average Jew and you say, no, that's ridiculous. I don't think that like my
Right.
internal
Look
soul.
at it. We look at an American way of like all souls are equal, all people, and there's no difference. But I want to ask you. I want to go drill a little deeper on this question of why it is that the Talmud and why religious Jews have such, an aversion to discussing Talmud and reading Talmud and Torah with not only non-Jews but with secular Jews. And my sense is, and again, maybe I'm coming at this from a secular standpoint, but my sense is that the reason for that is twofold. The first is that there's a concern, and it's probably a legitimate concern, that someone who is not experienced in Talmud would not understand it and might misinterpret it and misrepresent it. And secondly, that the very business of studying Talmud itself is something that requires a lot of preparation, and not just in terms of like intellectual knowledge and study, but my understanding is, for example, that the original Talmud authors, the Tanaim, the Sanhedrin, these were men who had reached a certain moral and spiritual position in their life. They had a certain standing in their community. They were a certain age. They had to be married with children. They had to have a profession, whether it be, a farmer or a woodcutter or whatever. They had to be self-supporting. There were all of these qualifications to make sure that the person who was studying Talmud was at a level, both spiritually and in terms of learning and intellectually, that they could study Talmud and they could understand Talmud. So I think that might be more why it is somewhat of an exclusive thing. And I think that factor is misunderstood by the anti-Semites, in that they think that somehow the Talmud is secretive, and that, there's something going on there, that's, like behind the large door, like you take some kind of secret oath or something, and, that therefore you're superior. So talk a little bit about that. Elaborate a little bit on why it is that there is this sort of separation with the Talmud.
I mean, Judaism is an intense religion, so much so that I would postulate that well over 90% of Jews would probably want to get out of it if they really knew what Judaism was about. And, certain statements, like if I said, you can only be a good Jew if you don't fear death. And you could look at that as like a, crazy statement. But if you look in the sages, it's like, Charles, I'm sorry, I can't teach you Judaism because you fear death. Once you get over your fear of death, maybe you will be able to understand Judaism. And the sages themselves use this kind of extreme language. Like you open up the book and it's, stories of martyrdoms and our suffering.
Yeah.
And the Talmud is tougher than the worst anti-Semites. God forbid, there was this new documentary on the city of Joel, and they played at the Detroit Film Festival. This was online this year, the Detroit, Jewish Book Fair and Film Festival. And they played this documentary on Kiryat Joel. And I have on my YouTube channel, Professor Howard Luprovich, good man, expert in Hungarian history. He does not like Satmar. And he opened up and he said, basically, the Satmar Rebbe said the Jews deserve the Holocaust. In a crazy statement like that, God forbid, like we got a strike on our show. But from a certain way, obviously the sages and the Torah loves the Jewish people, but the understanding of the Talmud and the sages is that bad things happen to the Jewish people is God's method of punishing us for our sins. So from that perspective, like I always said, the Lubavitch Rebbe is the only major sage that didn't straight up say that, God forbid, the Jews deserve the Holocaust. The Lubavitch Rebbe said you can't understand suffering and God has his ways that are beyond our ability. But Reb Shach, even the Lubavitch Rebbe's father-in-law, almost all of the Rebbes, just straight up on Jewish theology. I'm sorry, that's how Hashem works. We sinned and that was our punishment. So obviously from that perspective, if you're going to tell me like your typical American Jew, that's what Judaism is, most Jews want no part of it. You
Right.
say,
I mean, it's outrageous, but yet I understand it.
But is
You
our
know,
religion. So you want to
it
change our
is.
religion in a
Yeah.
certain sense. Like, I can't be part of a religion that says we deserve the Holocaust. That's
Well, the thing is,
impossible.
I think it is a stretch to say that we deserve the Holocaust. However, there is a part of the religion because we can't know that. I think the by any definition, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was right about that. I mean, this is a mystery, but if you do look at the Torah and you look at Jewish history, you look at the writings, you look at the prophets, you see that when they knew God, when they raised their spiritual level, then they received blessings and they received reward. And when they turned their back on God and when they fell away from spirituality, they experienced suffering and punishment. And that is kind of the entire narrative that runs through the whole Torah, right up from the time of Moses up until the destruction of the temple, right? First, and for that matter, the second temple. So I get where that is in place, but that doesn't mean therefore, because only God knows. I mean, we can't speak for God. And I think that if you take a look at something like the Holocaust, that wasn't, that was something that happened in the world. That wasn't happening just with the Jewish community. And you could argue, I suppose, from a Jewish perspective, that much of the world had fallen away from God at that point and did not know God, and that they had gone in the direction of sin, of idol worship, of creating a man-made God on earth, a man-made utopia called Nazism or communism. And that therefore, and that included Jews to a pretty good extent. And so the result was terrible suffering. And not just for Jews either, by the way. I mean, there was suffering for a lot of people in World War II. So, I mean, that's how I see it. Maybe that's a secular view, but
Let me just hit you straight with what I would call Orthodox theology that probably majority of Orthodox people don't really agree with because it's too strenuous even for Orthodox Jews. But what's said in the Torah, the Talmud, the sages till today is, God chose the Jewish people in order to benefit the world and cause certain things to happen to the world, and gave us the law, the Torah, as a method to do it. And if we don't, and the Jews generally don't really want to do it. The Torah says it. The sages say, that
we
God
never have. Right, exactly. It's always been.
But God forbid, the part why most Jews reject our own Judaism, and it makes sense according to what the sages say, God forbid, is that if we don't do our job in, so to say, like Claire Caw, who was always saying, you have to preach the Noahide laws to the Gentiles. And the sages themselves says it, the Torah itself says it, the Talmud says it, that we have a free will opportunity, and if we do it, we'll be rewarded. But if we don't, God will use the blood of his own children to teach these lessons to the world. And so it's a kind of a scary thing. You could look like a Catholic Christian understanding of Judaism. And it's just like, okay, I'm a Jew. Me and Charles, we're out here. We're trying to talk to the public and change the world for the positive. But when you bear the title that, like, yes, I'm a Jew, it's possible that God is going to use our blood to teach the lesson to humanity. And so when your average Jew says, I'm a Jew,
possible, but
they don't really want to accept that. Like, so it says, what does it mean when I say I'm a Jew? And you say, well, God has the right to use me in whatever way God chooses. And God laid out the way that we're supposed to do it. And if we don't, unfortunately, and my rabbi Moshe Wolfson, who I studied under, most people probably haven't heard of him, but in Brooklyn, Amunas Yisrael, he was Torah Vadas. And God forbid, he said that if you look at the sages in the warnings of the Torah for what's going to happen if, when Messiah comes, or if we don't do the mitzvahs, actually, God forbid, the suffering that happened to the Jewish people, you could find God's mercy, because relatively what the suffering that became to the Jewish people is actually much, much less than was warned to us in our own books. I mean, Rabbi Dooovid Gottlieb at Or Sameach, when I first went there, he went over the Holocaust, God forbid, and the curses in Deuteronomy. And he said what happened during the Holocaust that isn't directly warned in the curses of Deuteronomy for not following the law. And from that perspective, say most Jews are gonna be like, no, that can't be Judaism. If that's Judaism, it's ununderstandable, or it's a mystery. So I just surrender. Believe Hashem is good. Suffering, it's hard to understand suffering in the Jewish role, the Jewish take on suffering. I think most Jews have a hard time understanding or accepting what the texts themselves say. So if you're going to come up like, no, I think Judaism means something, but it means something different than what the books and the sages say. And even most Orthodox Jews have mindsets like that. That's why the Lubavitch Rebbe said, labels are for suits. When someone asked the Lubavitch Rebbe, is he Orthodox? It happened a few times. He said, labels are for suits. Everybody falls short. Like the Lubavitch kind
Well,
of.
that's right, because we're not God. We're images of God. And
So
as
there's no
far
such thing as orthodox. You're saying we all fall
well,
short, and there's also the mission purpose. You're saying like
right.
you're a Jew, doesn't that mean you're on a mission to save the world? Like when you say like you're a Jew, is that could you translate that as saying like you're on a mission from God to save the world?
Well, yeah, yes. I mean, this gets into the mission of being a Jew, and I think that you make the point that, in a sense, if you are a Jew, then you can't really escape that, no matter what you do, because that's who you are. It's something it's hard to explain how that is, but it just is. And as far as the Holocaust goes, I just want to reiterate that, while it is part of the faith that we suffer when we sin, and that nevertheless, how that translates in real life is not something we can possibly know. Only God knows. And for us to presume to know that and to make those sorts of claims, that's a rebellion. That's a heresy. I mean, we're being, in a sense, we're turning God into some kind of an idol that man can control. But,
If you want to put it back to Israeli politics on that, like things like Yom Yerushalayim, Israel Independence Day, Holocaust Memorial Day, according to the rabbis, those are heretical. Holocaust Memorial Day can only be celebrated on Tisha B'Av. God gave us a day for mourning. And I mean, this is just straight Israeli politics.
Right. And that's an argument that could be, look, rabbis included, Jews generally have not agreed on these things. We can't know because, ultimately, we're not going to know. We're not going to, there are 3 Jews or 3 synagogues. But I want to talk a little bit about the Talmud. And by the way, the martyr business, the Jew is willing to die to preserve his Jewish identity. And that's something that goes through history because we do believe that, there's something greater. And I mean, obviously the most famous example of that was Jesus himself, who died before submitting to the dictum of the Roman authorities.
Or for Jews, I mean, God forbid no Jew is going to quote Jesus, but Rabbi Akiva,
no, but yeah,
who says that he lived his whole life. When we say Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your soul. And Rabbi Akiva said that means giving up your life. So when Rabbi Akiva was tortured to death, God forbid, he said that finally he gets to fulfill the mitzvah of dying as a martyr. And even I mentioned Bobov. I studied in Bobov, and the Noam Elimelech, who he was the fountainhead of a lot of Hasidic movements, his brother Reb Zusha, and a lot of stories had a stark view. He held that when you say Shema Yisrael to fulfill the mitzvah, you have to accept martyrdom. That he said when you say Shema Yisrael, you should picture yourself being burned in flames as a martyr. And that and some people even argue that, no, if you just say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and you didn't picture yourself being martyred, God forbid, you didn't actually fulfill the mitzvah.
Yeah, amazing. And there's been examples of that throughout Jewish history. I mean, I'll point to during the Crusades when you had errant crusaders, starting to decimate Jewish communities in the Rhine Valley. The Christian church was very vexed and very upset over the phenomena of Jews standing up and being murdered rather than conversion, and women willing to jump out the window before they would convert, and so you had these instances throughout Jewish history, and I think that there is something about that that's very powerful.
Well, I'm saying because it's basically every other page in the Talmud. So when you pick up the Talmud, it's a gory book. And it says things that are basically unfathomable. And if you look at it from the perspective of like a Jew who wants to serve God, it's good that it says those things. You say like, no, I'm a real deal. I want to serve God. I don't fear death. God forbid. And so the Talmud is, so your average 20th century American is going to pick up this book and it's like, what the hell? It's like Rome, God
Oh,
forbid,
I
it's like the
know. And you end
counter-Semites.
up
It'd be like you're backwards
yeah.
people. And then the Orthodoxy, like the base, what do you really believe? Like it's Adam Green grilling me like, do you denounce this? Do you denounce that? And I'm like, no, I don't. And
Right,
I do
exactly.
think we are going to rebuild the temple. I do think the statements of the sages are true. However, despite all of these scary things in our text, that God's essential nature is loving kindness and good.
That's right. God is good, and that evil exists in a vacuum of good. Um, and that the Talmud, I just want to, the Talmud was basically codified during after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, when Rabbi Yehuda Hanazi, the prince, wrote down the Mishnah. And I think he was also the head of the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was a body of 71 men, all elected. It's actually an incredible story that the Sanhedrin could have sat for several centuries in very turbulent times under the Romans, and had maintained that kind of level of morality and vigor and ethical strength, and to have codified the Mishnah, and then the Gemara was codified both in Palestine and in Babylon, and the one in Babylon is the predominant one because the Babylonian yeshivas, particularly Pumbeditha and Metzamara, were really prosperous, and there was a great and vigorous Jewish life in Babylonia. These were Jews who had stayed back at the time that Cyrus the Great granted the Jews the right to return to Judea, and that they would sometimes go to Judea, including Rabbi Hillel, who was Babylonian, Hillel the Elder, and they would try to lead revivals within the Jewish community there. But that was really the main intellectual and spiritual center of Judaism for many centuries. And that they wrote the Gemara, which is the more popular version of the Gemara. The less popular was the Palestinian Gemara, which is thinner and which is not as authoritative. Now, my understanding is that these books, the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is the Talmud, how influenced were they by Greek thinking? I mean, wasn't there an element in them that involved like the Greek dialogue? Like when I've read some of the Greek, I'm not a Greek scholar, but I have read in the Greek. And if you look at Platonic tractates and and whatnot, and Aristotle, they would have like a roundtable discussion where different people would take opposite positions, and they would go around the table and they go, we think X, Y, Z, and then the next guy would come in and say, well, I think A, B, C, and here's Y, and then they would go at it, and they would record everything, and then at the end they'd have some kind of consensus. Now it seems to me that that's how the Talmud, the dialectical style, that sort of describes the Talmud, because you've got things in there that are very opposite and even at times violently opposite, and yet it's all there. It's all part of the overall text.
I make two separate points on that, and straight to your question about how much comes from the Greek. I mean, that's a matter of scholarly dispute. Obviously, the sages of the Talmud, the major sages, were in Babylon under the Persian Empire and the remnants of that. But in Israel, the main influence was Greek. Hanukkah, and even when the Romans controlled Israel, more Jews spoke Greek than Latin. And there's certain scholarly, like a creation ex nihilo. If you read the biblical account, it doesn't mention anything at all about creation ex nihilo. It mentions like waters above and below and sea serpents. And some people think that the whole concept of creation ex nihilo was even taken from the Greek, but that's a matter for scholarly debates of which ancient culture influenced what. And then on the general just framework, the local liberal downtown synagogue I promote on my YouTube page, or used to before they changed directions. I used to give the sermons on Friday night occasionally, and during Vayikra, no one else signed up to do it because they're very difficult parshas talking about like animal sacrifices and menstrual impurity and various things. And so there's the dispute between Nachmanides, the Ramban, and Maimonides, the Rambam. And we talked about on my channel, the book, where Maimonides says, yes, we did kill Jesus and it was the right thing to do, as opposed to Nachmanides, who disputed that. But this dispute, Nachmanides said that the formation of the temple, of the Talmud and the Mishnah in Rabbinic Judaism wasn't really Judaism. It's just a memory for us till we eventually rebuild the temple, return to Israel, and could fulfill the mitzvahs properly. Like Charles mentioned, he's a Zionist, saying that the ancient prophecies were returning to Israel. But like when we say the prayers, or even keeping Sabbath outside of Israel, that some people, according to Nachmanides, that you don't even have to keep the mitzvahs outside of Israel. The whole reason we keep the mitzvahs here in America is not because God rewards us and punishes us. It's to remind us that eventually we have to return to Israel and rebuild the temple, as opposed to Maimonides, who takes a dispensational approach, that whatever happened in the temple through animal sacrifices, that God caused that to work. Now God causes our prayers to do the exact same thing. So Nachmanides is saying, no, when we say the prayers, that does not cause the same thing to happen when we offered sacrifices in the temple. And the only reason we say the prayers is in hope that one day we'll get Israel back and rebuild the temple. So that's a major dispute between Maimonides and Nachmanides, how we look at these texts, because once you open up the Talmud and the Mishnah, almost all of it is describing how the temple worked. So if you have a rabbinic Judaism that no longer needs the temple, why are we going to spend, like I spent years and years, like the Karliner Rebbe, who's been in the news recently, I think he had COVID-19, but he's really speaking out against Haredim and, COVID-19, and that they should take it more seriously and, be good Israelis, so to say. But the Karliner Rebbe, I remember I went to him speak in Israel, and he said, you should try to learn 3 sessions of 4 hours of Talmud every single day, and minimally 2. Like saying even like an average yeshiva student should attempt to sit for 4 hours straight, 2 times a day, learning Talmud, and if possible, 3 4-hour periods a day, and saying, what are we learning? We're learning basically, we learn a lot of things, but probably like 30-40% of what we learn is how the temple operated. So the question is, why do we care? Like Charles, you're a historian, but you're not trying to be a rabbi or something, or look in Judaism. Do you want to dedicate 10 years of your life to understanding how the temple operated?
Sure. It's it's metaphorical. There is no temple, but there have been periods in our existence where we didn't have the temple. Before the creation of the first temple, you had the Mosaic period, you had the period of the Judges and Joshua, and you had King David. You also had no temple between the destruction of the first and the rebuilding of the second. And I think it was around the time of the second temple that Judaism began to develop rabbinic Judaism, in that the temple was controlled by people who were not always, operating in the best interests of Judaism. You might say they were, some of them, the Sadducees, they were similar perhaps to today's ultra-liberal Jews. So you
say like your Protestant Zionism, you're saying that the sages don't mention they're going to be returned to Israel to form a modern secular nation. It mentions that we're going to reestablish the divinity of the kingdom of David, that we're going to reestablish the Kohanim and the Levium and rebuild the temple. There's nothing about forming a state. However, you could have a modern, like some sort of dispensational understanding, like Maimonides, that the Zionists use. That's like, no, we're not going to reinstitute the Kohanim in the king. Although surveys in Israel show that almost as many as 30-40% of Israelis prefer monarchy.
Well, first of all, I do think that it's an integral part of Judaism to pray for the time that the temple is rebuilt and that this hastens in the Messianic age. But how that happens, whether it's the right time for that to happen, that's something that's a mystery. My understanding is that if you go very back to the very beginning of the Jewish experience, right at the foot of Mount Sinai, when they built the golden calf, that the Jewish people have to raise to a certain spiritual level. They have to know God and thus serve as a light unto the nation, so that the world will know God before that can happen, before you can have we are at a level of holiness that you can have the rebuilding of the temple. I don't know if we're there yet. I pray that we are. I'm not sure if we are, but we don't know. We have to think about that. We have to look within and ask ourselves that. But obviously, we're not there yet. But the creation of the state of Israel as a Jewish state, that also is equally as important. Going back to Abraham, when God told Abraham, "Go to the land that I will show you," there was no mention of temples. There was no mention of temple in the entire Torah. When God told Moses that that he would not be allowed to cross the river along with Joshua and his hosts because he had sinned, and he allowed certain tribes to stay on the east bank of the Jordan because they were not going to be in the promised land. The book of Deuteronomy lays out in very clear terms the very borders of that state. They showed each of the tribes and how their borders would look, and that this was the land that God had promised us. Why he promised it, who knows? I don't know. It's a mystery, but he did. That's in the Torah. And that it was nothing than it was the late Rabbi Marvin Antelman. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
You mentioned him on previous streams.
Yeah, and I interviewed him. I wish I still had that. I interviewed him before the time when we had internet, so I unfortunately don't have that. The author of the to eliminate the opiate, and he spent half the year in Israel and half the year here in near Boston. Um, and he said, look, the Israeli people, just by being there, have fulfilled about 2/3 of the 613 mitzvahs that make up the Torah, according to the rabbis and the Talmud. Because if you are in Israel, it's not easy to not be kosher. Not that they don't have that; they do, unfortunately. You can't observe the holy days because things aren't open. Even if you go to the beach, you're probably more observant of the holy day than you would be if you lived in Boston. Um, and that thus by being in the land, they have fulfilled a large portion of the Torah. So taking possession of that tiny swath of land is a prerequisite. You can't build the temple unless you take possession of that tiny swath of land first. So you have sovereignty, so that you have the control over your life and your destiny, that you're developing a holy commonwealth that can serve as a light unto the nations. Now, is Israel today a holy commonwealth? I think that it actually is in many ways. I mean, it's not perfect because there's no such thing as perfection. Only God is perfect. But if you take a look at modern Israel, whether people are religious or not,
Relative.
yeah, that's right. But there is.
I mean, you're giving the Alan Dershowitz. It's like, find me another nation type.
Well, it is what it is, and that it is a vigorous moral society. It's not perfect. There's a lot of sin, of course, because we're humans, but it is a dynamic place. There is something about it, and the anti-Semites like to point to the fact that Israel, in the course of war, has the army has committed atrocities, um, and I feel that that's a slander. That's a blood libel because while mistakes are made in war, they have very high standards of ethics when it comes to confronting an enemy that is trying to annihilate them. So I
It's
think that
interesting if you compared the commonalities of what anti-Semites and believing Jews believe as opposed to what Jews who don't believe in the tradition would believe, there's a lot more similarity between believing Jews and anti-Semites than your average Jew on the street. And it comes down, from a theological, metaphysical level, these questions of like dualism in Spinoza, like Spinoza is still excommunicated, and Spinoza argued against dualism. And from a metaphysical level, most of these claims of Judaism to be true depend on dualism. They depend on this impersonal Hashem that operates completely independently of the material laws. And it's not a material phenomenon like a Jew is in Israel and it makes a difference. It's based on a theological dualism. And I would guess that the majority of Jews would flat out reject dualism, would more support Spinoza. And that's why, even concepts like that all Jews work together. So your average Jew would be like, no, that's not true. But Orthodox Jews and anti-Semites would kind of, agree, like, no, there's a Jewish strategy, and if you're a Jew, you can't get out of it. You're acting on this Jewish strategy no matter what. And even the concept of having the modern debates of multiculturalism, to say like we want multiculturalism and immigration in America, but not in Israel. So I'm trying to pin it down to these theological, metaphysical basis, saying like, Charles, are you a dualist?
Yes, I am. And the way I understand that, this is interesting because I think that Spinoza was one of the heresies that he engaged in was to deny that by saying, basically being a pantheist, which is to say that God is in everything, that God is in plants, God is in rocks, God is in the air, God is in the sky. Whereas I think that the Jewish understanding is that God created the universe, in a sense, separating the universe from himself in his own mind by creating something, by spinning something off. That doesn't mean that God doesn't control it, or if at will, or that God isn't can abolish it or can do whatever God wants, but that man is not God, the animals are not God, the plants are not God. We are created, we are separated. So there is a dualistic element, and in a sense, the Spinozian idea of pantheism actually is a pretty close reflection of Eastern religions, like Buddhism, or like religions and beliefs of the Far East, which is that everything is one, and that the earth and the sky and the spirit all exist as the great chakra or whatever it is.
Well, if you
And
get to approaches like, my mother's, Reform ancestors, my grandfather's grandfather was a very famous Reform rabbi, Rabbi Bamberger, who even participated in the 1893 World's Parliament of Religion in Chicago, representing the Jews as a Reform rabbi of the Workmen's Circle. But the tradition, from the Reform was basically like, yes, this is our tradition. And unfortunately, it's false. That like, yes, I do all these things. Like I make kiddush on Sabbath, and I wear tzitzis, and try to put on tefillin and all these rituals. But unfortunately, our ancestors didn't know any better and believed in false things like dualism and some sort of impersonal God that resided outside the material realm. But this is our tradition, and it's like, I meet a lot of Orthodox Jews, and it's like, what the hell, these, they're driving to Sabbath, or they're, driving to synagogue, or they're doing these rituals all wrong. But, the Reform attitude was like, well, yes, this is our tradition. This was our ancestors, what they did to make the best out of their situation and interact with the spiritual forces. But unfortunately, it's not true. It's just what our ancestors did. And as a believing Jew, to say it's true basically requires dualism, to say there is a God who acts outside of the forces of the material realm, who cares that I do these things and interacts with me in a way based on how I follow these laws. And I would say, even to most Orthodox Jews, very few people could even conceptually believe in it, and the training of the modern materialistic atheistic society is very difficult. So even Orthodox Jew, it's more like identity. Like they never really thought about the deep theological, metaphysical issues. They haven't studied to understand the difference between dualism and Spinoza. And it's just kind of like cultural of, this is my identity.
Right.
This is what I do because this is who I am, whether it's true or not.
Well, the ethos you're talking about with Spinoza is the predominant cultural ethos. It's atheistic. I mean, Spinoza was not only excommunicated by the rabbis of the Netherlands, of Holland, but he was also banned by the Dutch Reformed Church, and that the Pope sent up an emissary to visit Spinoza to evaluate him, and he came back and he said he's a blasphemer and he's evil. So he was hated by all the religions. I mean, it was kind of an equal rejection, and I think that it was for that reason that he was a pantheist. He wanted to worship, the earth. I mean, he felt that everything was God and that God was everything equally, as opposed to there were separations. I think that
I made the point on Shabbatai Tzvi. We had the episode where if you watered down to say Shabbatai Tzvi just made one mistake. I mean, he probably wasn't, made a whole bunch of mistakes and did bad things, but theologically, we talked about this, the greater good for the Jewish people. And can a Kabbalist make a calculation that there's this greater good for the Jewish people or the world that could sometimes override following the law, which is similar to Jesus and Christianity, and kind of like Chabad and Zionism, that that's like, Charles, here's the list of what a Jew has to do, and you either did it or you didn't, and if you fell short, you're a bad Jew. But you're saying like, no, okay, I fell short, I did put on tefillin, a lot of days, and occasionally, God forbid, something came up and I didn't follow the Sabbath rules like I should, but I did a lot for the Jewish people. And the overall calculation, like it says in the Tanya or Shabbatai Tzvi, is despite me falling short on the law, I'm a good Jew because I did a lot for the Jewish people. And to say from an anti-Shabbatayan or Kabbalistic view is those calculations are forbidden. You're not allowed to make calculations like that. And that's the unique part of Zionism and Chabad. It's like, yes, we do make calculations like that. And I don't care if Charles didn't put on tefillin today, because he did a lot for the Jewish people.
Sounds like there's a lot of rationalizing going on there.
Well, it's just a question of, can you make calculations like that or not? Is it no, you didn't put on tefillin today, you're not a good Jew? Or is it, okay, he didn't put on tefillin, but he did a lot for the Jewish people that outweighed
I don't think so. I think if you don't put on tefillin in that regard, you're not a good Jew. I mean, it's that the Torah gave an extra level of observation to the Jewish people to separate them from the nations, to make them a holier, a priestly sect, if you will. Now, of course, one of the great misconceptions of the anti-Semites and even of some Jews is that the idea of the chosen people, the holy people, is because we are to physically control the world and create a one world government, and to do so through espionage, and to do so through either because we can't outright conquer, we subvert the moral order. I mean, this would be the kind of stuff that our friend E. Michael Jones would talk about.
We got Brundle asking the chat, Ricardo, it was too risque for the Luke Ford show where I mentioned, is it possible that Epstein and Maxwell were really doing this for Israel? And maybe they did do all those crimes. But God forbid, maybe they were blackmailing people and funneling money in order to support Israel. And if you looked at all the crimes that they did, and then you could add up in some way that, like, no, I mean, Maxwell and Epstein actually did more for the state of Israel than anybody you've ever met.
So did they think that absolved them of their sins? I mean, I guess it goes to what you were saying earlier. Well, if I'm doing good for my community, and then that absolves me of committing other terrible, grievous sins. And I don't think so. I don't think that's consistent with Jewish understanding or Jewish law or common sense. That sounds to me more Shabtai Zvi-ish, if anything. The idea
it's the full extent of the argument. Why are we talking about whether you put on tefillin this morning or not, versus because you did a lot for the Jewish people?
If you didn't put on tefillin, then you are not as good a Jew as you could be, and that's between you. That's your your day of reckoning. You'll that's on you. I mean, it's no one's perfect, but don't try to equivocate it and try to apologize. Create false apologies. I mean, that's in a sense idol worship. You aren't a good Jew if you don't do these things. I mean, and you if you're willing to live with that, fine. We all live with stuff like that. No one's perfect, and we're all sinners. But don't pretend that it's a virtue. I mean, in a sense, the Shabtai Zvi model was to take evil and not only declare it good because it would somehow bring about some sort of a redemption, but to venerate it, to in a sense, like, this is one of the great conundrums of modern moral society. We take things that we know are wrong and that are unnatural, and not only do we declare them good, but we venerate them. I think the Jewish approach is that you understand that we fall short, that we do sin, that we do have aspects of our choice, and we're free will, and we make choices that are wrong, but that they're still wrong, and that we will pay a consequence for them in terms of either on earth by committing crimes, or karmically, or well, I don't want to use that. That's an Eastern word, but spiritually, there will be consequences for that. And
since we're talking Judaism, I mean, the technical terms, you have Bein Adam Lamakom bein Adam lechavera, between man and God, and between man and friend. And we just had the high holidays, and generally it said God could forgive us for if me or Charles didn't put on tefillin today, God could forgive us for that. But if me or you wronged our fellow person, that we need the forgiveness of that person. So I mean, if God forbid, Maxwell Epstein somehow really did a bunch of good things for Israel, uh, that could make up for the fact that he didn't
No.
put on tefillin, but it can't make up for the fact that he committed crimes.
It doesn't make up for anything. It's good that he did it, but it doesn't make up for anything. The judgment will be rendered, regardless.
Well, you have to say that if he did good things for Israel, God has to reward him. That Epstein, okay, is he burning in hell? According to Jewish theology,
I don't know, but probably.
Epstein probably makes it to heaven.
He
probably spends a year in purgatory. Well, I'm just being honest.
Yeah.
You're saying, according to Jewish theology, is Epstein going to heaven or hell? And you say, well, he's probably going to have to do some extreme purgatory, but eventually he'll probably make it to heaven.
No, I don't know. I don't think Jewish theology would say that anyways. They would believe that's a mystery. That's up to God. I mean, nobody can determine what happens when we're at the day of judgment. I mean, to suggest that's almost idolatrous. But I want to just shift gears a little bit here. I had a conversation recently, actually somewhat of a heated conversation, about Talmud and about Jewish law as it relates to American constitutional understanding. This was a talk about the confirmation of a Supreme Court judge who...
I was watching Blackburn. You had her on her channel. I watched all 4 days, just before we came on. I watched the whole Supreme Court, and I saw Marsha, Senator Blackburn.
She's amazing. Yeah, incredible woman. And the idea is that the judicial nominee, that being Amy Coney Barrett, has said that she's a contextualist, that she's an originalist, that she's going to look at the intent of the Constitution as it was written and what it meant, and when she renders legal decisions as the primary focus, and that the idea of coming in and making law from the bench is acting like a king, is acting like a royal, it's acting royalty, it's actually creating law out of fiat, and that the Constitution itself says that the only body that legally has the right to make law is Congress, and they have to operate within the law, and states and state legislatures. And my friend argued to me that actually, the Supreme Court should be a living court for a living constitution, and that they need to make law depending upon the needs of the people at a given time, and that this is what the Talmud did. And so I said, well, I thought the Talmud was something that tried to adhere to what God intended in the Torah. It's not making it up. They're not going off into a tangent and saying, oh, this is convenient for us today, and this is what we want to do. And my friend argued to me that the Talmud does do that, and this was the example that she gave. She said that in the Torah, Moses' wife, Zipporah, circumcised their first child. And therefore, it is, from a Torah perspective, perfectly legal for a woman to circumcise a male child. And yet the rabbis in the Talmud said that this is forbidden. And they said the reason it's forbidden, they said, well, it wasn't really Zipporah who did the circumcision. It was really this man who did it. And they came up with this very convoluted and twisted way to deny that the woman had done this, and as a way of banning women from doing it. And then furthermore, spinning out of that was the idea that women are not full human beings, and that women have a lesser soul than men, and that they're to be subservient to men, and all of this. And I'm asking you about it because I think that actually is true, that the Talmud probably, was not adhering to the Torah in that regard because it didn't fit the image of what the rabbis wanted to say at the time. So you could say that might have been an activist decision, like Roe versus Wade was an activist decision by the American Supreme Court. And so I wonder therefore it gets to a more fundamental question, which is the Talmud supposed to interpret the Torah? Is it supposed to uphold the intent of God when he gave the Torah to man at Sinai? Does it try to maybe look at the Torah from a perspective of practicality and how it translates into everyday life? But nevertheless, the ultimate goal is to try to adhere as closely as possible to the intent of the Torah to the degree that we know it, and not go off the reservation and make stuff up.
Well, I would push back from an Orthodox perspective. Absolutely not. It does not matter what it says in the Torah or the Talmud from your perspective. The law is what your local Orthodox rabbi says, not what the Talmud says, not what the Torah says, because the Torah itself says that we follow the sages of the generation, and there's a process for following the sages of the generation. And if you're not a sage, you can't look into the Talmud and the Torah and decide for yourself what God wants. You have to follow the current sages. So if you reject kind of the organizational, the papal infallibility of that system, but from an Orthodox perspective, it's like, no, absolutely not. You do not have the right to look in the Talmud. I mean, you should look in the Talmud and learn Talmud, but that's not where Jewish law comes from. Jewish law comes from the sages of the generation, and the sages of the generation, to some extent, they're not prophets. The rabbis aren't prophets, but they're God's beacons in the generation. So that perspective is very difficult. Like as a Baal Tshuva, someone in yeshiva, I remember early on in my yeshiva career, there was some question. I think it was like putting tefillin on during Chol Hamoed, and I asked somebody, and I was like, so what does the Rambam say? He's like, what do you care what the Rambam says? And he was kind of making the point. It's like, you can't just, like, I like the Rambam, so what's the Rambam say? I'm going to do what the Rambam says. He's like, no, you're not allowed to do that. You're in a yeshiva. You have to ask your rabbi and do what he tells you. You can't just look at the Rambam and say the Rambam says this and you did it, because it's this oral tradition that doesn't mean, oh, the Talmud was written down and you read the oral tradition. Oral tradition means, to some extent, that the rabbis of the generation speak for God and speak for the law. But on the like kind of Protestant pushback side, the Talmud Sanhedrin also has this delocalized authority where the majority of cases don't need a rabbi or a central authority of body. And I'm not sure how much you've studied like Sanhedrin or the Talmudic law, but certain small cases, you just need one person, or you could have three upstanding adult males. You don't even need a rabbi, right. Just 3 adult males. Cases
to adjudicate a dispute or something.
Yeah, I mean, cases of death require 23 people, and then you had the Sanhedrin, which had 70 people, and that was kind of like the Talmud itself. That's the word of God.
Isn't it their obligation to try to adhere as closely as possible to what is perceived to be God's mind and God's will?
No, I mean, the Talmud says very clearly.
Where do these rabbis get that kind of authority? I mean,
there's a Gemara in Baba Basra that has the famous story, I think Rabbi Eliezer, that is meant to prove this point, that Rabbi Eliezer says the law, and the rabbis say the law, and then miracles happen. And the point of the story is, we don't listen to miracles, we listen to rabbis. And at the end of the day, no, it doesn't. That's why I told you the other day, Judaism is not really a Protestant religion. Our text says, do not follow your heart. Our text clearly says, do not follow your heart. So if your heart is telling you something, oh, I know God is saying it because I can feel it on my heart, that's not Judaism. Judaism directly says, do not follow your heart.
Well, and also it says follow your mind and follow the Torah, but I mean, in a way, what you're describing sounds to me to be very Catholic.
I'm not quoting Catholicism. I'm saying,
no, but I mean this idea. I mean,
don't Catholic follow your heart in your eyes. That we say
but the Catholic idea is, we could take away the Pope, but it's listen to your cleric, listen to the bishop who decides what is said. Don't pay attention to the Bible. Don't pay. It's the Pope who is here on earth to make those decisions.
Oh, so I meant to make this point earlier to clear up historically, like in the time of the Talmud, probably till maybe the Vilna Gaon, the Hasidic movement, most Jews didn't understand Judaism. The Talmud uses the expression Am Ha'aretz, and the people that really understood Torah was a very few percent. The Torah makes clear anybody could learn Torah, everybody should learn Torah. But the people that actually do among the Jewish people is pretty rare. And so you have, kind of the law, and the people that you're supposed to recognize, the sages, and the people as your average Jew, you have the effects of Protestantism that you could just look into the Bible and determine it for yourself. But I would say within Judaism, there's never once been a Protestant type way. That would be referred, Protestantism in Judaism would basically be referred to Karaiteism. It is saying like, oh, Charles is a
or
Karaite. He thinks he
yeah,
can
but I
just look
also,
into the Torah and determine the answer for
well,
himself
no, I
without the
mean,
sages.
I think you look to the sages, but at the same time, some of the sages, these sages are human beings, and some of them may be corrupt, like Shabtai Zvi.
Well,
I
I
mean,
mean,
if
saying that's true, but you
we
can't.
expect the sages to interpret the law, just like we expect the Talmud to interpret the law
There is
in
no
a way.
scripture alone. I mean, there is no scripture alone in Judaism. That's what I'm saying. Like Protestantism,
Yeah, but
scripture
to the
alone.
degree that there is, I mean, or rabbinic responsa or decisions or Talmud or any of it, it's because it adheres to and tries to understand the mind of God, and when it deviates from that, it's heretical. And there have been deviances. I mean, it's not perfect. You know, when this person tells me that the Talmud decided that women could not circumcise because they didn't like that, even though the Torah says that, I see that as a mistake in the Talmud, because the Talmud was made up of men, and that they did have their biases, they did have their opinions. And you could say this about any religion. You could say it about Islam. I mean, there were mistakes made, some of the prejudices of Muhammad, some of the violent sides of his personality were codified into that religion. And the question is, are those things really the mind of God, or are they the mistakes of an individual? And it's impossible to answer those questions. But I think that if we're going to look, in a way, the whole Haskalah movement was a rejection of that kind of rabbinic authority. It was like, who are these rabbis that they can decide questions of what's right and wrong? And we don't need to have that. We can look at the Torah, we can look at our own community, and think about this. But that doesn't mean that you reject, in a sense, it should be as a way to get closer to the mind of God, not to move away from it, to become more spiritually enlightened, not less.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned, because I always make the point that all Jews require conversion. Even the Reconstructionist Jews have a conversion process and a board of like rabbis and Jews that determine who's a Jew or not. And I used to always joke or just astonished at the trying to make minyan in different places, people counting different people, Orthodox people, that might not even include me, or people including women or conservative converts. But even the Reconstructionists have an idea of minyan and don't hold that you could just say Kaddish. So I took like a Protestant view, and it's like, why do you need, if you're Reform, why do you need a conversion process? Can't you just determine, I'm a Jew, I decided I'm going to become a Jew, I read the Bible, now I'm a Jew. What's some rabbi going to change in the process? So there is no form of Judaism, as far as I know, that believes you could just kind of self-think, I'm a Jew, I'm calling myself a
No,
Jew,
of
I'm a
course
Jew
not.
now. Even, saying, because there is no such thing as Protestantism in Judaism. You can't make up your mind for yourself by looking at the books and the text in the Torah. It has to be determined by the authorities of the Jewish people. And even if it's secular
Right.
authorities, no repair the world, social do-gooders are going
Yeah,
to
but
let
at
you
the
come in
same,
and just say, I'm a Jew. They're going to be like, you need to convert. You need our authorities
that's right.
to.
But Dooovid, I would say at the same
Was that
time, and
wrong? Are you saying that's wrong?
no, I'm saying that at the same time and for the same reason, those same authorities can't just make it up as they go either. They can't decide that they can go up to the bima and publicly eat a ham sandwich and declare it kosher. They have to also adhere to certain standards of understanding that go back to Sinai, and that are there. This same friend of mine, by the way, said that the whole idea of separating meat and milk in diet is made up by the rabbis, because there's only one reference in the Torah that says you cannot boil a kid in its mother's milk, that they developed this whole elaborate system of laws around separating meat and milk. But I mean, my response to that is, it does say don't boil the meat. I mean, I think that does mean that. And it says it 3 times. It was obviously a very important thing. Now, can we know the literal meaning of that? Did it mean that according to my friend, a way of keeping us away from idol worship, which it probably did. And did the Jews of the times of the judges, were they separating meat and milk? I think they probably were. I mean, I think it does mean that in that we have a hint at the mind of God. We can't know. I mean, the Talmud, the Torah has a lot of ambiguity. We can't know everything. Otherwise we'd be God. But it says enough that we can derive from that statement. And I think the rabbis did and did so quite well, that it meant separating meat and milk.
Well, I mean, that could mean you are both somewhat taking a Protestant approach to Judaism, but, you know, like I did the time in the Orthodox areas where, you know, as I said, like no one ever asked me what I think. And even your statement, I think, in Orthodox places, like no rabbi ever opens up with I think, because it's like no one cares what you think.
Right.
You know, the sages.
Well, there was, as Thomas Jefferson said, there are certain things that are self-evident. It's not a matter of what I think it is. It obviously is the case. And I think that the rabbis who determined that were able to see that. I mean, it seems obvious to me that this is, if you just look within, it's not a matter of thinking about it. It's just, you look at the plain language and you can tell. And I look at the Torah, as I said, very pashut, I'm very surface. I don't go deep. I don't understand the mysteries. And when you just look at the simple language, it looks to me that is the case. And then when you look at the rabbinic understanding of that over centuries and millennia, that further confirms that is the case.
One of you like me is saying, like, do you have a rabbi? Or if you ask Dooovid, like, I don't have a rabbi, I have 100 rabbis. So if he's like, no, like, you know, talk to Doovid's rabbi, and I could, you know, spit out any name because I know hundreds of rabbis. But like, no, I don't really have a rabbi that I ask my questions to and listen whatever he tells me. And I'm a bad Jew. I couldn't do that. I couldn't, you know, do what Pirkei Avos says in the second Mishnah, Aseh L'Kol Rav, make yourself a rabbi. And, you know, when I was in Israel, you got to go speak to the rabbi and just do whatever he tells you. And I had a pretty difficult situation. You know, obviously, like being a half Jew, what the Hebrew texts say about it. Like I did speak to the rabbis, and I listened to them in the beginning. You know, they basically told me to leave my family and become a Haredi Jew in Jerusalem. And they showed me the texts and the books and all this stuff, and I listened to them and I did it. But then eventually I pushed back, even though that's what the books and the rabbis said. And I'm kind of a bad Jew. I don't like asking rabbis and then doing what they tell me. But my understanding is that's Judaism. That's not just Orthodox Judaism. Even in Reconstructionist Judaism, at the end of the day, basically, you ask your rabbi, you do what your rabbi tells you.
You do, but at the same time, and this gets into another question, there is a sense of progress through history. I mean, that we do learn things historically, both literally in terms of the sciences and the hard sciences that advance our civilization, but also philosophically, that the Jew today is not the same person as the Jew that stood at the foot of Sinai or that was at King David's or King Solomon's dedication to the temple. And that's because we have we have free will, and we have the ability to reason, and we have developed knowledge in areas that have made us different. And I think in that sense, the Jew today is American, and that the American concept is one of free will. We can do good and we can know God. We can also sin and take the consequences of sin. And that, I think that maybe you could say this is a Protestant idea, probably is, but we look to God as the ultimate authority, the ultimate sovereign, and we humbly accept the fact that we have a limited sovereignty on earth for a very short period of time. And as Jews, we then get together with other Jews and we congregate and we study the sages, but we do it in that context.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like Pirkei Avos, I have that basically memorized. I did a series on it. I've read that hundreds and hundreds of times. When I was a gabbai in synagogue in the summer, I went over it. So from like that perspective, if an issue comes up, I'll usually go with what Pirkei Avos, and I consult rabbis. Like I think like Luke Ford, I talked to, and I don't know how many rabbis you know, but like I consult tens of rabbis on every major issue because thank God I know a bunch of rabbis.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But I was never able to, and that's probably why, God forbid I'm not married, I'm not really part of a community, because I couldn't humble myself, so to say, to make a rabbi and just do what they say. But my impression is that that's basically Judaism. And the pushback factor in me that's pushing back against it doesn't derive from Judaism. And like what you said, Maimonides is a neo-Aristotelian. And God forbid, we know the history of the dispute. And Dooovid, I'm Platonic in a lot of ways because I'm a dualist. But we're both neo-Aristotelians. And Maimonides largely draws on Aristotle to say these things about reason. And maybe Protestantism you could make as a draw from that.
Or Americanism. As I said, we're Americans. We're Jews, and we look to our, the belief in the King of the universe.
Well, I remember when I first got to Israel, one of the first things that they drove into me was it's not progression, it's regression. That if you're in an Orthodox yeshiva, the understanding of the tradition is society is not progressing, it's regressing.
That's amazing. I've not heard that, but I think that a simple observation of reality would indicate otherwise. But anyways,
maybe in technology in certain ways, but in terms of the knowledge of God and the level.
I would even say in terms of political philosophy, spirituality, these things we've learned. I mean, there were events in history that changed the way we understand things. One of those events occurred on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence. We learned that people can be sovereign under God, and that, they grant governments, or rabbis, if you will, a limited authority to protect those rights and defend those rights within set laws. That's the American ideal, and I don't think it contradicts the Jewish ideal. I mean, you seem to say it does. That's interesting. Maybe
the legal process.
Or maybe it contradicts a certain
jurisprudence that the weight of the
Jewish
previous
law
generations outweighs the weight of the current age scholars. You can't I said, you're not allowed to argue with Maimonides, so to say. When you come up with your proposal about Jesus and say that the Jews didn't crucify Jesus, you're not allowed to just say, I disagree with Maimonides.
Yeah, but there were other rabbis who also disagreed with Maimonides who are very authoritative. So, those are questions that,
I'm saying that's the Orthodox perspective, that you, Charles, are not allowed to disagree with Maimonides. You're allowed to agree with Nachmanides and say, I don't know why Maimonides said this. I just go with Nachmanides on this issue. But you're not allowed to say that Maimonides was wrong.
No,
and it's kind of the jurisprudence, because he comes from the previous generation, and people in later generations can't argue with people in previous generations because of this legalistic regression concept. There's not a progression, it's a regression.
We have to look at the people in previous generations in the context of their own times and what they were dealing with.
But I'm saying that's historical. That's heresy. That's historical analysis that I like. But there's really no precedence. I mean, that's basically biblical criticism to do that, and is largely heretical. You're not allowed to.
Well, but Maimonides himself was accused of engaging in biblical criticism.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the nature of Judaism. That I told you that, if we did crucify Jesus, it wasn't because we were bad and evil. It was because God told us to. That God said, if God himself comes down and tells you not to follow the law, you have to put God to death. That there's no question, according to Moses, that even if somehow God was able to take human form and came down and told us not to follow the law anymore, that the law itself says that the punishment for that is death.
We talked about, I talk about this in my new book. God is God. Let me just hold it up.
I'm saying the level of
that I think that to the degree that Jews in Judea supported Jesus's execution by the Romans, it was not because they thought he was God. It was because they didn't think he was God, and they thought he was a troublemaker and he was a renegade. If they had thought he was God, they would have become Christians. Anyways,
I'm saying I'm giving an opposite interpretation. That let's say the true followers of Jesus, who thought that this is possibly Messiah, possibly God. However, he's telling us to violate the Sabbath. And we know that God told us that even if God himself...
I don't think Jesus told anyone to violate the Sabbath, did he?
Well, it's a question of how you interpret the New Testament.
I think
I'm just giving I'm giving the righteous interpretation of Jesus's followers
Yeah, but I
fulfilling
think
Jesus's
that's
will by having him crucified. They weren't evil and had Jesus crucified.
I
They
get
were
it, but
righteous and had Jesus crucified because God was like Abraham being tested, that God came down to test the Jews
mhm.
and say that you're like, look, I'm God. You don't have to do all these laws. And but would say, well, if you're God, you previously told us that if you came and told us we don't have to do these laws anymore, that we should have you put to death. And it
Well,
wasn't
yeah, but I
like,
mean, just as a matter, and I'm not a very deeply learned in the area of the life of Jesus, but my understanding is that Jesus did not call for the violation of the Torah. He was a devout Jew, and he adhered to the Torah and said so on many occasions. And those are quoted in the Gospels and the Book of Acts. It says Jesus said that not a single jot or tittle of the Torah shall be changed forever. It's forever, and that the covenant with Moses is forever. We're reaching toward the end of the program, Dooovid. I just want to also mention one thing, because this reminds me of another point you made, and that was that with the Noahide Covenant, and which was derived by the rabbis in the Talmud, that the early Christians, I mean, it was sort of agreed to by most people in the world, including the early Christians, because there's a passage in the Book of Acts where St. Paul is in Antioch speaking to Jews and non-Jews, and proselytizing, and the question comes up, how can we convert non-Jews to this religion? Because don't forget, back then they still thought of themselves as Jews, and Paul didn't know the answer to that question, so he ended up going back to Jerusalem to ask St. James. Now, St. James was a devout Jew, and he inherited Jesus's ministry when Jesus was executed. We controlled the ministry for 30 years. He was like the Rebbe. And so Paul goes and meets with him in Jerusalem and asks him this question. And St. James says, go forth and proselytize. However, make sure that you emphasize essentially what is in the Noahide Covenant. In other words, he went through the laws of the Noahide Covenant. For as long as the people of the world follow that covenant, then they'll be saved. And so that's New Testament. So I think that it is something of a universal theme. Another one of these things that is misinterpreted by anti-Semites sometimes. But anyways, Dooovid, why don't you share your last thoughts, because we're reaching the end of the program.
yeah, I appreciate you having me on. It's funny you mentioned that, because I prepared a lot of research, and on my channel I've done these streams where it's me reading these academic papers for hours and hours. And one of these days I've already prepared the papers and read them multiple times on the origins of the Noahide laws. And there's a lot of interesting academic literature. Were the original Christians Noahide? Were they trying to spread the Noahide laws? Do the Noahide laws come from a non-Jewish origin? And there's just like the historical Jesus, it's very complicated. There's a lot of scholars. There's a lot of unknowns, and I wanted to focus more on like the metaphysical, spiritual implications of what are the various theories imply. And I was thinking in the way that if you say Jesus Christ according to Judaism, how does that become, if we're trying to spread the Noahide laws and somehow we end up with the idol Jesus Christ, that from Hashem's perspective, the only idol that is acceptable to worship, so to say, is Jesus Christ. And it's saying it's not acceptable to worship as an idol, but because the concept of worshiping suffering on behalf of humanity is acceptable, that if you're saying that to idolize the concept of suffering on behalf of others is actually in the spirit of Judaism, even if it comes in a false idol of Jesus Christ. And that's kind of from a Jewish attitude, it has to be God's providence. Why did God raise up Christianity to be this religion? And there's the certain, the Noahide principles that are spread through it. And also this concept that Judaism is teaching, that it's a venerable thing to suffer on behalf of humanity.
Yeah, I mean, it is very Jewish. Very
Hasidic also. I mean, like I mentioned,
yeah.
the Noam Elimelech and all these, the Jesus principle of suffering on behalf of humanity is a Jewish principle. It's a
That's
Hasidic
right.
principle, and
The
almost
suffering servant.
all rabbis suffer on behalf of humanity. So like every rabbi I books about, all of those people are famous. because they did for others and didn't want reward for it, and they were really even willing to suffer.
Right. I mean, it's fascinating. And the suffering servant of Isaiah gets into that. So, Dooovid, you and I could do a really interesting conversation with someone who is steeped in Christian thought. And, we could talk about some of these things. Uh, Somebody like Jay Dyer comes to mind. If we could get him on, that would be amazing. Maybe we should try. But we should do it again soon. We should have a guests on who we can really go over these questions with, and maybe do so maybe in a little bit, I could do a little bit more due diligence in terms of organizing rather than my usual free form. And we could do some great programming in that regard. I really would like that and look forward to it. So,
Definitely. I've been
Dooovid,
promoting interfaith for
yeah.
years, and we
Uh,
never have these conversations.
Oh,
I'm
we
saying it's
should.
good interfaith, and that's why I did on YouTube. And I'm not sure, like with the people I do interfaith with, that they would be the right audience. You probably need someone like Jay Dyer
Yeah,
or a scholar. You're saying
that's
like a
right.
pulpit rabbi or a community leader
We should
has
try
to
to
be
find
too.
these people and see if they want to come up. But Dooovid, let my viewers and listeners know where they can see your YouTube channel and information about you.
Yeah, I'm a Dooovid on YouTube with 4 O's. My Yiddish name, like legally, you see my name. Took birth, and I respect my family and my, God's decision of what my soul entered the body of my family. But I go by Dooovid because I like talking about Judaism, and it's the Yiddish version of because in real life I don't really talk much about Judaism. Like I'm a civil engineer and do different things. So all of my social media is Dooovid. With 4 O's. I have a lot of programming that I'm trying to produce. I'm actually promoting a theory on consciousness called the multiple truth hypothesis. I'm in touch with John Francesco Repi, Church of Entropy, different Adam Green, trying to promote debates. And actually, I mentioned to Adam Green now. I think he just got kicked off YouTube. That I would do dark web debates with Nazis and Holocaust deniers if he wanted to host those, that I would appear on the dark web.
So would I. I would have. That's was my whole purpose of getting into broadcasting, was to interview people of somewhat extreme views, because I want to understand who they are and what makes them tick. I mean, if this was in the 1930s, I would try to interview Hitler. I mean, it's we need to understand and bring people out and find out why they think the way they do, and if it's a wrong way of being, which it is, and I would argue, we can expose it. And I think people are intelligent enough to see that. That's how you stop extremism, not censor it. You bring it out and you debate it and vigorously take it on. Do it with both fists, but don't try to, by covering it up, it only makes it worse. I mean, this is one of the things I actually agree with E. Michael Jones on, even though he comes at it from a very different.
Well, I hit you with, I agree with you 100%. That's why we're friends. However, I think that it's not the Jewish way. That we're talking about is based on logic and Greeks and Enlightenment. And unfortunately, the Jewish way probably
the Jewish way is to suppress.
Yeah, so
to suppress your enemies. And
so I'm at least willing to say, like, there's a reason why it's only me and you and a handful of people out here, because it's like, unfortunately, censorship does have a long history within Judaism.
I know it, and it's becoming a big problem, especially with the ADL. But let's not go there. Anyways, Dooovid, thanks so much for joining me as always, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, shalom. Thank you.
Thank you.